Hello, everyone. Another week. This week we want to talk about again the Power BI CI/CD side of things, and this is not just Power BI. Now we covered that in our last video, and have MJ here with me today, and then we're going to talk more around the whole Fabric, and because within the Fabric workspace, it just bundles so many different amazing things into that same workspace, right? Even though it look and feel like the Power BI workspace, but the report is only part of it now. So MJ, coming from years of development background, so very familiar with the whole Git side of the world and how that can be used for version control and all the different things. So very keen to get your view on how we can actually make this work for everybody moving forward. So I'll give the floor over to you.
All right. Thanks very much, David. And I think you pointed out a very important point there, David, is that because in Fabric, it's not just Power BI report. You now enter, multiple personas now. You now have data engineers, DBAs, data analysts, data scientists, and everything, right? Now,
Yeah.
more than ever, this is the time you actually have to look at something like Git or collaboration, right? Because in Power BI, it's most likely just Power BI devs or analysts, trying to work collaboratively. But now, with this unified workspace, there's now much more and bigger personification that's going to happen, right? It gets some bit messier if the workspace is not properly configured. So this is again an opinionated approach on a kind of like a best practice of what this workspace management could be in Microsoft Fabric, right? So let me share my screen and get started with this. Okay, so this is a diagram or a representation of the whole how the whole thing works, and we'll go into this in detail, right, for the next few minutes. Okay, so obviously there are two pieces here. We have Microsoft Fabric and workspaces in particular. Then we need to have Azure DevOps. As of this recording, it's only Azure DevOps that's supported by Fabric, and including myself and everyone else are all waiting for GitHub integration as well. So Microsoft, please support that soon. Everyone's keen on using GitHub. um, okay, so I think the most obvious thing that you might see here is that this Dev one feature branch and Dev two feature branch, right? This is like the core of it. Like one of the really good practice in this regards is that each and every developer gets their own workspace. And one thing that I have to mention though is that this personal workspace is kind of like still bounded within that project. So this is not the same as the my workspace that you might be familiar with. So this is like something like David's project XYZ workspace, right? So it's kind of like still bounded on that project, right? um, for many reasons, right? Obviously, you don't want to use your my workspace in case you're working on multiple projects, right? So it just gets a bit messy as well. And second is that Git is not actually enabled in the my workspace itself, but on project workspaces only. So yeah, like that's the first thing, right? Like having that dedicated workspace just for you, David, just for me, MJ. We can kind of like make sure we don't touch each other when we're working on, let's say I'm doing pipelines and notebooks, and you're working on reports and data flows. So we don't touch each other's stones when doing this kind of like development experience, right?
Yeah, I really like that idea actually. So, like you said, so there's that isolation, so I can focus on what I do without having to worry about what MJ is working on, and just very quickly on the workspace as well. So the workspace itself, like they're free, right? And
Yeah.
I guess in this case, probably need to add the Fabric capacity so you can
Mm.
do the Git integration through this workspace. Is that right?
Yes. And the thing is, this works, but yes, absolutely. But the thing is, this is where I'm going to introduce this concept of, short-lived workspaces.
Oh, okay.
So, right, like short-lived workspaces in my vocabulary means that you provision this workspace. And again, this works really well with Fabric because of the whole capacity management and serverless nature, right? So these short-lived workspaces are, the life cycle is just during the time when you're developing that feature, right? And then you shut it down. When you're finished with that feature, you provision a new workspace and like so on and so forth, right? And then again, this allows you to incur like all this cost center later on would be in the development point of view, right? This is not like a an environment kind of like point of view of cost center, like in terms of capacity planning. So you
Mm.
won't be sharing this same capacity from production workload or staging workload and things like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, yeah, like that concept a lot actually. So it's a workspace that for a very specific purpose. Once that purpose is fulfilled, the whole workspace gets shut down. And then if later on there's modifications to the thing, a new workspace, like let's say I'm a dev, my personal new workspace will be split up again.
Yeah, exactly, right. And yeah, again, there's so much flexibility out there as well, right? And this also promotes a lot of those exploration, right? Like let's say, like let's say David keeps bugging me around, hey, I want to try this new ML framework, right? And like but I don't want to touch the whole environment and like so on and so forth. Like how can you iterate on that? Like, how can you work on that specific feature without touching the whole thing, right? So having your own personal workspace would really help in that regard. So yeah, like let's say you want to test out new features of Power BI or new features of this and that, like you can have your own kind of like POC workspace that doesn't really bump to the workflow that the project we're working on.
Amazing, amazing. Yep.
Yes. Now, in terms of collaboration, this is where Git really shines. Again, we mentioned before that Git allows you for versioning, pull requests, and commenting, history, tagging, and so on, right? So many good features of Git that you can leverage in that one. So what that means is that let's say your branch, which is attached to that workspace, right? You then send a pull request to the develop branch, and then someone like me or someone else can review your work. Then if we're both happy, then we merge it into develop, right? So what happens is that when that change that you've made gets merged to develop, aka via pull request, that then is Git enabled to a development workspace within Fabric. Now, again, this is where it gets a bit funny or complicated. This development workspace, right? It's a shared development workspace for us. Right? It's not meant to be a personal dev workspace, right? This is kind of like what internal developers are maintaining of. Like, let's say it's like a composition of everything that we're working on or we've worked on. That includes pipelines, notebooks, reports. So this is an environment that all of us are kind of like, all of the devs are in charge of maintaining, making sure that this still works. Right? This is not meant to be, something that breaks all the time, although it happens, and you probably want it to happen here rather than the upper environment. But it's still kind of like a shared workspace for all of us, right? And there are a lot of controls you have to put in this place to make sure that David just doesn't accidentally push a report into that dev workspace or myself and stuff like that. We enforce in a way that it's only Git who can allow you to, make changes in this workspace, right? Same goes with the develop branch, making sure that you lock this in. No, I can't just push changes directly to the develop branch. So this kind of like introduce that locking system, to begin with.
Just paraphrasing a little bit here. So we have our development. So I'm a developer. Let's say you were the head of a development lead or tech lead here. And so when I finish my development, I'm happy with it. I will push my change into my feature branch and then submit a pull request. So that development branch, it feels like that's the place where the developers agrees. Like, so let's say there might be conflicts, there might be like different things, but like, we all agree that, okay, we can't resolve everything in the development branch. And then that development branch is synchronized with the development workspace.
Correct.
So even though not necessarily everything works after we synchronized it, but at least that's what we all agreed upon.
Exactly.
And then we can do a bit more, I guess, testing and different things and see how everything kind of work together. So you might be working on the pipeline and I might be working on the report. I was making assumption that the data structure is this, but all of a sudden there's one column missing. We'll find out in the development. Yeah.
Exactly, man. You got it right. Like this is again more of like political and collaboration rather than the tool itself, right? You're actually solving a lot of those issues or like conflicts, so that developers don't fight each other.
Yeah. Not too much. There's a referee somewhere to hold the balance and make that decision. And I guess the other thing you mentioned is the fact that as a developer, I cannot push things into the development workspace.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like
So I
someone
have
needs
to
to
do it
review
by.
it, right? Like
Yeah.
even if you're the boss or at least and like in good principle, right? Like
Yeah.
you wouldn't want to do it, right? You always want someone to review your work prior to getting it in there.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
Now, disregard this main bit for a moment. I'll get back to that later on. Now, once it's in the development workspace, right? Now, on this side, these are all that green background ish there, and that red arrow. Now, this is all Fabric, right? Like here, outside of Git in this regards. Why would you want to do this? Many reasons, right? Like, let's say some testers or some pilot users don't want to use Git, but you want to expose them to, staging environment or obviously production environment, right? Second is admin controls, like, an admin in the Microsoft 365 capability can properly safeguard that, okay, only these people can do this, and they don't need to have access to DevOps. And like, again, it's a whole pooling kind of like policy that you can easily implement, right? Um, then lastly is that, separation of duties, that this allows you to, let's say, we'll name someone Andrew. Andrew can, who's not a developer in our team, can kind of like promote that development into staging and staging to production, right? And maybe that person, Andrew, is a product owner, or, let's say, in any project director or anything like that. So Andrew doesn't really need to work in Git. And at the same time, there's actual audit capabilities that, hey, Andrew, click this button. He didn't tell David to go to Git and merge this to main branch or, staging branch or something, right? That's kind of like one of the advantages as well of this. Like, you have a separate bounded context that, hey, you're trying to deploy within Fabric, right? Not really just on Git.
Yep. Yep.
So
Interesting.
yeah, like, yeah, that just goes to staging. Like, obviously staging is probably optional, but highly encouraged, so that, you have a pre-production environment. Let's say prior to production, you want to show this to some users and like do some UAT, user acceptance testing, and so on and so forth, right? Now,
so typically in the development world, that I'm assuming they are connected to different data sources, right? Development will be a development database, and development database is just it just pretty much keeps the table schema and those kind of stuff, and there's not too much of real data in there. Well, there shouldn't be any real data in there, but staging is where we can actually take the user into testing, right? Because like my understanding, normally, well, best practice is the staging database should be like, slightly behind production database. And then, once everyone agrees, everyone is happy, then we can actually push it into production. There's actual fair bit of actual work involved in just kind of like maintaining the 3 different workspaces as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, right? Like, now you're in that Fabric zone. You know what I mean, right? Like, now you're, when you're doing this release cadence and stuff, you're not in the Fabric zone. You're not outside of the DevOps zone.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, once it's released in production, right? Now, this is where, as part of that best practice, and again, this is optional. It's not enforced in any way, right? It's a good idea to merge, your changes in develop branch, any sort of like stable releases, into main branch. So you want the main branch in your Git to be kind of like representing what production is, right? Again, it's not linked in the workspace level, but it's kind of like representing what's in production. Meaning, if it's, release 21, release 75, it's represented whatever's in main branch kind of like, represents in production. So that and it's also a good idea that in Git, there are features around like tagging. Let's say, R21, R22, so on and so forth. So even though they're all in main branch, you still maintain kind of like a historical tagging of what all these releases are, right? Again, these are all just kind of like accompanied best practice, right? Not required, but and not enforced, but it's a good idea to kind of like just to keep track of things.
I mean, normally if we don't have this Fabric pipeline capability, then all the it's always going to be synchronized, because the dev branch and the production branch will always link to the appropriate environment. But in this case, it's almost like we have 2 things running in parallel. That it makes me a little bit nervous, knowing how things can go wrong, will go wrong. So that's it's a very tricky thing to manage, I think.
But the other thing as well is that, David, is that when you have that release tagging, right? You can also easily roll back. Let's say you have 75 files that you change, right? And let's say, it's release is not successful. How are you gonna roll that back? And again, in the deployment pipeline, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's no concept of rolling back. There's only rolling forward, right? So that means that you can do the rollback within Git, from that tagging, like, hey, uncommit all of these 75 files that we've changed for this release, and then roll forward again to development, staging, and production, right? That kind of like allows you to kind of like roll forward through Git.
Yeah, like I'm wondering if, let's say you have development branch and then you cross to the Fabric side, and use pipeline to push everything into production? Is that a way to kind of then synchronize with the main branch from production? And then you sort of do this compare thing with the
Yeah, the problem there,
branch.
David, is that you can synchronize them, but they're not tagged properly as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I know.
yeah, so that's why again, yeah, and again, right, the Andrew scenario, we don't want Andrew to synchronize, do the work for synchronizing for him, or like that whole Git stuff. So this is kind of like something that just helps developers to, like version their things.
Yeah, I mean, we released a short video last week regarding to the fact that now all the repository don't contain data files anymore. So the repositories are so small, and then it allows for this kind of capability to happen. That's something that, I personally, I know so many other developers has been waiting for such a long time. So this is a extremely like exciting moment. Finally,
Yeah,
we can actually make this all happen. Yeah, but there's a lot of things, like you mentioned, the process wise, the control governance still need to put in place. I remember when I first worked on Power BI, company adopts it, and like in 1 year time, the whole organization, there's probably like so many different reports out there, and it's just completely lost track.
yeah,
And I
version
think
one, final three.
final, yeah, final. Yeah, so I think having this kind of framework also helps from that regard. So like you mentioned, product owner, they're the one who is responsible for certain part of the data or reports, and they should have control to say, well, this is the single source of truth. That's this production workspace.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Now I know, David, you have a question for me.
Yeah, yeah. This looks great from a developer, like coming from a technology. Well, you coming from the technology side, like kind of being just around the data thing for a very long time. So we both kind of experienced it a fair bit. We both really like this kind of framework. But I'm just thinking, right, from let's say there's a finance team or there's operational team, and the analysts over there, they're not fully exposed to the whole Git thing, and this can be quite overwhelming, like all the new concepts, the branches, the workspaces. Like if we want to simplify this, and so we want to simplify that, but still having the ability to do version control, because like that's the main thing for Git in this. The one of the main value that it adds is, okay, if anything goes wrong, I can roll back to the previous version without having to keep all the physical files. Yeah, what do you think? Is there a way that we can achieve that?
Ye- Absolutely. And I know you'll be asking that. That's why I came up with this simpler diagram, right?
Yeah,
So this is a more, like a simpler approach that basically you just talked about, right? So if you looked at this, well, first off, we don't have a develop branch anymore. We just have the main branch, which is like when you create a repo, that's like what's out there. And then the developers can just, start branching out from main. Okay. And then the concept of that branch is still connected to a workspace, it still applies, because you still leverage the whole goodness of isolation and stuff like that. And now the pull request process is just, between that branch and main branch, right? Like whatever's in main is in main, right? And that main branch is already connected to like a staging or a pre-production environment, right? I would still highly discourage to, that main branch is connected directly to production, for many reasons, right?
yeah,
But again, this is kind of like optional. Um, but then having that staging still allows you to have an end-to-end workflow of like, maybe there are pipelines, there are notebooks, there are like reports that needs to be integrated seamlessly. You still have this environment, right? And then still applies for in like, within the Fabric context, just deploy from staging to production, right? And that's outside of Git. And everything that we've talked about earlier about, tagging, Git tagging and stuff like that, you forget that. But
yeah, because
it's
now I only
like,
have one branch.
yeah, because you just
Yeah,
have main branch, right? And that main branch
yeah.
represents what's staging already.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that a lot. Now I have a single branch in the repo. I still keep my development workspaces. Still should be short-lived workspaces that there should be a process to switch it off once the thing is completed. I like the fact that now staging and production this will only have two different workspaces like to manage as well. Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking out loud. I think in this kind of scenario, in the pipeline, there should be a effort like put in keeping staging and production always have that green tick, right? Like,
Yeah,
because there's no version control on production directly anymore. It's just purely relying on staging. So yeah, yeah. So anything that's not synchronized, there should really be cleaned up on a regular basis as well. But no, this is great. Yeah, no, thanks.
Yeah. And again, right, that's why it's called opinionated, because there are a lot of different factors that you have to consider, and it's like my opinion on how or what a best practice is, right? And again, there in even larger organizations, right, you have to consider like multi-tenancy. Let's say staging is separate from different domain altogether, right?
Yeah,
And production, then that means you can't actually use Fabric workspaces for that or for deployment pipeline anymore. Or what would happen is that that's going to be linked to multiple Fabric instances rather than
yeah,
workspace level, right? So that's
yeah.
another thing to consider.
Well, that's where like the Git kind of becomes quite beneficial because I can still have a single repository that keeps everything together, but just pointed to different what do you call it? Tenants.
Mhm.
Yeah. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Like different tenants, right? Different Microsoft Entra, tenants and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, again, right? There's a lot of considerations. Like, what if you don't have Azure DevOps? Well, what can you do? You don't have Azure
Rude,
DevOps, so
rude.
right.
Yeah, yeah. But I think like so creating the repository in Azure DevOps, that's all free. This is all kind of whether your IT team is gonna or your Microsoft 365 Office 365 admin is gonna have the process to allow for that. One thing I do want to point out is one of the good thing about the workspaces with the Git integration is two specific folders in
Mm,
the repository. So what that allows is actually one, let's say we in the same team, we work on 5 different projects, and each project can just be its own folder in the same repository. So our team only have one repository, but the different workspaces, different projects kind of just connect to the folders within that repository. So that kind of help to simplify it a little bit
yeah,
further.
and actually, you pointed out one important bit there as well, David. Wherein like the Fabric people is just working on the analytics bit of the whole project, right? So that's like dedicated to just that folder itself. But then everyone can align that, hey, full team, full 75 development team in this one repository needs to
Yeah,
use Git for any deployment, right? So you're kind of like still centrally governing everything through Git. Yeah,
yeah,
again, so many different instances where that can work, that cannot work. But again, having this kind of like guidelines would be a first good step, rather than not using them at all, I guess, right?
yeah. No, I think this is fantastic. Like, we've obviously only covered 2 different type of general scenarios, but depending on the need and requirements, restrictions, capability of your own organization, you can kind of create more like different arrangement that suits your own
Yeah,
environment as well.
exactly. Like things like, what if I have Databricks capability as well, right? Like now you're entering that territory of like, oh, what if I also have different this different that, like again, this is a first step towards that kind of like big picture. And again, what we keep on saying, it's saying as part of this whole DevOps principle or continuous integration, there's also the continuous learning as part of this.
Yeah,
You learn what works and like try to see what works for you, and yeah, like
yeah,
base it off from common principles. But at the end of the day, your problems are different than ours. So yeah, like,
yeah.
oh, let us know, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think like borrow one of your terms from one of the earlier video we did together. So this concept of like a full stack data specialist now. So
Mhm.
we do the data pipeline, the reporting, data science, like everything can be done in one person. And I think Fabric really kind of lean towards that as well. At least that gives people that capability to actually learn different things once you understand SQL, Python, and like Power BI, that you can actually cover a lot of the different areas. So yeah, we're really excited about this, and yeah, definitely hope you find this video useful. We both certainly really excited about this area, and yeah, leave some feedback and comments, and
All
yeah,
right.
make sure you follow us if you like the content.
Yeah. And if you like this content, and if you think it's worth creating a full-blown course to do this, we're happy to, think about that as well. I think there would be a lot of, questions around this, like, full personification, like 20 teams, like how are they going to collaborate, right? And then this is kind of like a key area for Fabric to work on collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 100%. Great.
All right.
Well,
Till next
thanks,
time.
thanks,
Thank
MJ.
you.